Aaron Kosminski has to be the most well-known of all the Jack the Ripper suspects. He features in more books and documentaries than any other, and his candidature is supported by some of the talking heads at the modern Scotland Yard. If anyone may be regarded as the official lead suspect, supported by the old Ripperological establishment, it's Kosminski. In this episode, I'll evaluate the evidence against Kosminski to see whether this reputation is merited. It is complex, as many issues relating to the Jack the Ripper murders are, and as my regular viewers will have already noted. I will say again, there's a huge amount of detail available to us in the records about the Jack the Ripper murders. Some people try to claim that so much has been lost that we can't possibly come to any conclusions. I will present the evidence and you can make your own judgment on that. The primary source document that we know of Kosminski is the so-called Macnaghten Memorandum. This was written by the Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Branch of the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, called Melville Macnaghten. Remarkably, at this time, the most senior officers at Scotland Yard were not professional policemen. Macnaghten's background was in running tea plantations in India, and he got his police job through the personal friendship of James Munro, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. That was how things were in Victorian Britain. Munro's background was as a civil servant in India and was only appointed after the murder of Mary Kelly in November 1888. Macnaghten got his job in June 1889, so Macnaghten wasn't in position during the Autumn of Terror. Nevertheless, in February 1894, he wrote a memorandum summing up the attitude of the official hierarchy at Scotland Yard with respect to the Whitechapel murders in response to some newspaper reports. The memorandum was first written as a draft known as the Aberconway version because it was found in the papers of Macnaghten's daughter, Lady Aberconway. It said, "A much more rational and workable theory, to my way of thinking, is that the Ripper's brain gave away altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he then committed suicide, or, as a less likely alternative, was found to be so helplessly insane by his relatives that they, suspecting the worst, had him confined in some lunatic asylum. No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer, unless possibly it was the City PC who was on a beat near Mitre Square. And no proof could in any way ever be brought against anyone, although very many homicidal maniacs were at one time or another suspected." Macnaghten mentioned three suspects, one of which was Kosminski, a Polish Jew who lived in the very heart of the district where the murders were committed. He had become insane owing to many years of indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women with strong homicidal tendencies. He was, and I believe still is, detained in a lunatic asylum about March 1889. This man, in appearance, strongly resembled the individual seen by the City PC near Mitre Square. The official version of the memorandum was kept at Scotland Yard and now resides at the Public Record Office. It had clearly been seen and edited by Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner in charge of the Criminal Investigation Department. Anderson was also not a professional policeman, although he had at least been a civil servant specialising in political crime and the prisons. The preamble was briefer. "A much more rational theory is that the murderer's brain gave out altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he immediately committed suicide, or, as a possible alternative, was found to be so hopelessly mad by his relations that he was by them confined in some asylum." It will be noticed that in the Aberconway draft version, Macnaghten tilted towards suicide as the more likely outcome, with committal to an asylum being a less likely alternative. This is because Macnaghten believed that Montague Druitt was the Ripper and he committed suicide. In the official version, the committal to an asylum is firmed up to being a possible alternative. This refers to Kosminski, who was Anderson's favoured suspect. The details concerning Kosminski were also subtly different in the official version. Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There were many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect. The official version adds that Kosminski had a particular hatred of prostitutes and removes the reference to Kosminski still being in a lunatic asylum. In the Aberconway version, the preamble and the section that specifically mentions Kosminski state that he resembled a man seen by the city PC at Mitre Square. This reference was removed from the official version. This seems strange as it incriminates Kosminski, Anderson's preferred suspect, and don't forget the official version had been amended under Anderson's oversight. The phrase, "he had a great hatred of women," might hint that the police thought Kosminski was gay. This sort of language was often used as a code for homosexuality. I've previously referenced a very influential book published in 1884 called Psychopathia Sexualis. It was believed that homosexuals were mad, sexually insane, and that the crimes were committed by someone who hated women. Ironically, these crimes showed signs that they were sexual lust murders. There seems to have been a heightened sexual aspect to them, with genital reproductive areas targeted when there were mutilations, which implies an infatuation with women perhaps, rather than hatred or misogyny. Major Arthur Griffiths, a friend of both Anderson's and Macnaghten, was clearly aware of the memorandum. In his book Mysteries of Police and Crime, published in 1898, he said of the three police suspects, one was a Polish Jew, a known lunatic who was at large in the district of Whitechapel at the time of the murder, and who, having developed homicidal tendencies, was afterwards confined in an asylum. This man was said to resemble the murderer by the one person who got a glimpse of him, the police constable in Mitre Square. Again, we have the policeman seeing a potential culprit in Mitre Square, not court. Anderson was appointed the head of the CID the day after the murder of Polly Nichols, and almost immediately went on sick leave. He took a trip to continental Europe and didn't return to London until just after the double event murders on the 30th of September 1888. In his memoirs, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, Robert Anderson reminisced about his role in the Jack the Ripper inquiry, most of which he missed. This passage gives a good insight into the arrogance and frankly idiocy of the man. I spent the day of my return to town and half the following night in reinvestigating the whole case. A day and a night was sufficient for Anderson to reinvestigate the whole case as it stood at that time. 6 unsolved murders, those of Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. What a genius. You have to wonder what sort of idiot would make such a claim. He continued, the last and most horrible of that maniac's crimes was committed in a house in Miller's Court on the 9th of November. Like Macnaghten, Anderson didn't consider any of the murders that took place after that of Mary Kelly as being by the hand of Jack the Ripper. He went on, one did not need to be a Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent type, that he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that if he was not living absolutely alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. During my absence abroad, the police had made a house-to-house search for him, investigating the case of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could go and come and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. And the conclusion we came to was that he and his people were certain low-class Polish Jews, for it is a remarkable fact that people of this class in the East End will not give up one of their number to Gentile justice. Anderson was quite sure he was dealing with a maniac, a claim he made repeatedly, but also a Jewish maniac, as Anderson believed that a Jew would not give up one of their own to Gentile justice. This can only have been a generalised logical deduction. It can't have been based upon the discovery of the real, actual example. If the police house-to-house search unearthed Kosminski, then it would have been quite remarkable, because none of the Kosminski siblings with whom he stayed lived within the search area. The search actually took place after Anderson had come back from his extended sick leave, so Anderson was being factually incorrect in claiming it happened during his absence abroad. And the result proved that our diagnosis was right on every point. For I may say at once that undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are not within that category. And if the police here had the powers such as the French police possess, the murderer would have been brought to justice. Scotland Yard can boast that not even the subordinate officers of the department will tell tales out of school. It would ill become me to violate the unwritten rule of the service. This passage reinforces the implication that the search did not specifically uncover Kosminski, but provided the police with the theory that the culprit must have been a Jew who was being hidden from the authorities by his co-religionists. And he believed that his theory was later proved right. We also see Anderson's arrogance in full force. If only he was able to use forceful French methods, by which he meant a lengthy arrest without trial with a bit of rough stuff to loosen tongues, then the culprit would have been nailed. Anderson had not been outwitted by the Ripper, no, most certainly not. But being an Englishman, Anderson's lips were sealed. How convenient. Having regard to the interest attaching to this case, I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer. But no public benefit would result from such a course, and the traditions of my old apartment would suffer. I will merely add that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him. In saying he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact, and my words are meant to specify race, not religion. For it would outrage all religious sentiment to talk of the religion of a loathsome creature whose utterly unmentionable vices reduced him to a lower level than that of a brute. Anderson never mentioned Kosminski by name, but it was clear who he was referencing. He mentioned that it had been identified, which parallels the city PC potentially seeing the culprit at Mitre Square. However, as we have seen, the official version of the Macnaghten Memorandum, which is effectively Anderson's version, excluded the mention of the Mitre Square identification, which implies he had little or no faith in the city police ID. So was this a different witness? Anderson's autobiography was initially serialised in Blackwood's magazine, and his reference to a Jew not giving up one of their own to Gentile justice caused some outrage among the Jewish community. A letter appeared in the Jewish Chronicle saying, "I fail to see upon which evidence worthy of the name he ventures to cast the odium for this infamy upon one of our people." Anderson wrote back in the next edition, claiming some of his best friends were Jewish. "I'm happy in reckoning members of the Jewish community in London among my personal friends." When the book version came out, Anderson slightly toned down the Jewish aspect. We know of Anderson's opinion regarding the culprit from a few other sources, such as this from 1892. It's impossible to believe they were acts of a sane man. They were those of a maniac revelling in blood. Almost 2 years before Macnaghten had written his memorandum, Anderson was expressing his opinion that the culprit was a maniac. A year after the memorandum, he fleshed out his opinions. He has himself a perfectly plausible theory that Jack the Ripper was a homicidal maniac, temporarily at large, whose hideous career was cut short by committal to an asylum. Note that in 1895, Anderson described it as a plausible theory. In 1910, this had become a definitely ascertained fact. Following the publication of his autobiography, Anderson said in an interview, "The assassin was well known to the police, but unfortunately, in the absence of sufficient legal evidence to justify an arrest, they were unable to take him. It was a case of moral against legal proof." Just how well known Kosminski was to the rest of the police, we will see shortly. Suffice it to say that if there wasn't enough legal evidence to justify an arrest, then he can't have had much on him. The case of Thomas Sadler, which I'll come on to shortly, illustrates that people were arrested and charged on flimsy grounds. So why not Kosminski? But according to Anderson, he was morally right about Kosminski. After Anderson's death, his son wrote his biography, in which we can find the following passage. "The criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent kind, living in the immediate vicinity, the police reached the conclusion that he and his people were aliens of a certain low type, that the latter knew of his crimes but would not give him up. Again, we see the combination of the overt maniac being protected by his people, the aliens of a low type, the local Jews. I've mentioned that James Munro became Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police after the murder of Mary Kelly. His predecessor was Sir Charles Warren, a career soldier. Warren was in charge during the Autumn of Terror. On the 15th of September 1888, Warren appointed Chief Inspector Donald Swanson as his eyes and ears at Scotland Yard. All the paperwork generated by the actual investigative officers in the East End passed across Swanson's desk, and Swanson attended liaison meetings with the City London Police, a force separate from the Metropolitan Police. Warren wrote a letter confirming this appointment, which said, "I am convinced that the Whitechapel murder case is one that can be successfully grappled with if it is systematically taken in hand. I go so far as to say that I could myself in a few days unravel the mystery, provided I could spare the time and give individual attention to it." If only Warren had time, he could have solved it single-handed. Idiotic arrogance among the senior amateur police chiefs was not confined to Anderson. I feel therefore the utmost importance to be attached to putting the whole central office work in this case in the hands of one man who will have nothing else to concern himself with. I therefore put it in the hands of Chief Inspector Swanson, who must be acquainted with every detail. I look upon him for the time being as the eyes and ears of the Commissioner in this particular case. Every paper, every document, every report, every telegram must pass through his hands. He must be consulted on every subject. Swanson was actually a real policeman, unlike Warren, Munro, Macnaghten and Anderson. Swanson spent the last 15 years of his career largely desk-bound, with Anderson as his boss for most of that time. He obtained a copy of Anderson's autobiography, to which he appended handwritten notes on various pages. These are known as the Swanson marginalia, and it provides us with extra information about Kosminski. The first note read, "Because the suspect was also a Jew, and also because his evidence would convict the suspect and witness would be the means of murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind." This amplified Anderson's belief that a Jew would not give up one of their own to Gentile justice. However, for a witness to provide evidence that would have convicted the suspect and led to the death sentence being passed, he would pretty much have had to have seen the murder being committed. Certainly, none of the known witnesses saw any such thing. At best, various witnesses claimed to have seen a victim with someone soon before they were murdered. Elizabeth Long claimed to have seen a man with Annie Chapman, but Elizabeth Long was a she and a her, not a he and a him, and she wasn't Jewish. Israel Schwartz claimed to have seen a broad-shouldered man assault Liz Stride, but Swanson himself said of Schwartz, "It is not clearly proved that the man that Schwartz saw is the murderer." Logically, as Swanson was correctly unsure that Schwartz had actually seen the murderer, Schwartz's evidence by itself couldn't have convicted anyone. 3 Jewish men claimed to have seen a man with Catherine Eddowes near Mitre Square: Joseph Chaim Levy, Harry Harris and Joseph Lewender. Lewender was the only one who gave any sort of description, although interestingly he also said he doubted he'd ever be able to identify the person again. That being the case, clearly Lewender's evidence on its own would not have been able to convict anyone of murder. The last possibility is that the witness was someone who doesn't appear in any of the extant police records and was not called to any of the inquests, which seems very unlikely. The unknown phantom is always the last resort of the ripperologist. The next note read, "And after this identification, which suspect knew, no other murder of this kind took place in London." Swanson wrote this adjacent to Anderson's claim that the witness was confronted with the culprit in an identification arranged by the police. Did this take place after the murder of Mary Kelly on the 9th of November 1888, the last of the 5, or after that of Francis Coles on the 13th of February 1891, which was the last victim added to the Whitechapel murder file. The last notation read, "After the suspect had been identified at the Seaside home, where he had been sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified, on suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, City CID, by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, he was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch, and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect." Here, Swanson fleshes out the details of the identification. The suspect was sent to a place called the Seaside home, where the witness identified him. Various attempts have been made to locate this Seaside home, the favoured option being a police convalescence home in Hove in Sussex. But it'd be very odd for such an important identification to take place at a rest home for injured or sick policemen. Other similar homes have also been proposed. It also seems strange that the suspect would have been watched by the city police if he lived in Whitechapel, which was within the Metropolitan Police's jurisdiction. But the murder of Catherine Eddowes took place in the city at Mitre Square, so it was for the city police to investigate. Does this again hint at the city policeman citing the suspect? That would mean that the Jewish witness was a city policeman who refused to identify Jack the Ripper. That would surely be a scandal of the greatest proportions. Finally, Swanson gives details of the actual mental institutions involved and confirms that Anderson's unnamed suspect was Kosminski and that he died soon after being committed. Swanson had already said in an interview as early as 1895 that he believed the culprit was dead. The theory entitled to the most respect, because it was presumably based upon the best knowledge, was that of Chief Inspector Swanson, the officer who was associated with the investigation of all the murders, and Mr. Swanson believed the crimes to be the work of a man who is now dead. The case against Kosminski rests purely upon the evidence I've just presented, is based upon the opinions of Anderson and Swanson, two of the most senior members of the Criminal Investigation Branch at Scotland Yard, which might seem convincing. So who was this Kosminski? Back in the 1980s, the asylum records were checked and Aaron Kosminski was identified and researched. He was Jewish and born in 1865 in Kłodawa in Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Two of his brothers and one of his sisters emigrated to England in about 1881, and Aaron himself seems to have arrived in 1882 when he was 16. Kosminski suffered from mental illness. On the 12th of July 1890, he was committed to Mile End Old Town Workhouse Infirmary, but was released back to his family 3 days later. On the 4th of February 1891, he was taken back to the workhouse and from there was transferred to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North Middlesex. On the 19th of April 1894, he was transferred again, this time to Leavesden Asylum in Hertfordshire. Aaron Kosminski died in Leavesden in 1919. How do these basic details sit with the information provided by Macnaghten, Anderson and Swanson? Firstly, he wasn't sent to an asylum in March 1889 as Macnaghten believed. March 1889 is conveniently only a few months after the murder of Mary Kelly, who Macnaghten believed was the last Ripper victim. In reality, Kosminski was briefly committed in July 1890 and finally to Colney Hatch in February 1891, a few days before the murder of Francis Coles, who was the last Whitechapel murder victim. Swanson gives no dates, but claimed that soon after the last murder, which Anderson believed was Mary Kelly, Kosminski was watched and then taken to Stepney Workhouse and then Colney Hatch. This was not soon after the murder of Mary Kelly. Stepney Workhouse was situated in St Leonard's Street in Bromley St Leonard's, now known as Bromley by Bow. Actually, Kosminski was sent to Mile End Old Town Workhouse on Bancroft Road, which is about 1.5 miles away. But this is a small error, as Bancroft Road would have been colloquially known as being in Stepney, and indeed became part of the larger borough of Stepney in 1900. But more glaringly, Kosminski didn't die until 1919. How could Swanson, who was the eyes and ears of the Commissioner and had access to all the Ripper-related reports and papers, believe that Kosminski had died soon after his committal to asylum? He said it in 1895 and in the marginalia. It's surely inconceivable that the police could have lost track of the man they believed was Jack the Ripper. We know from other records that notes were kept on criminal asylum inmates, where the police were to be immediately informed if there was a prospect of them being released back into the community, and inmates were regularly released back into the community. The Aberconway version of the Macnaghten Memorandum read, "He was, and I believe still is, detained in a lunatic asylum." So Macnaghten believed he was still alive in 1894, but this sentence was eradicated from the final version, suggesting that Anderson deliberately edited it out, presumably because he believed Kosminski was dead. If Kosminski really was the Metropolitan Police's lead suspect, how on earth could Anderson and Swanson make these fundamental mistakes? They didn't exactly provide extensive details about Kosminski, so one might expect that the basic background they did provide would be accurate. After all, we're dealing with probably the most well-known and supposedly unsolved criminal case in world criminal history. I hope you've enjoyed this film so far. If so, please subscribe, like and comment below and share your opinion. But most importantly, carry on watching as there's plenty more fascinating details to come. There has to be a good chance that Swanson and Anderson were conflating different cases. I've mentioned the murder of Frances Coles on the 13th of February 1891. She was the last Whitechapel murder victim on a list retained by Donald Swanson. It's sustainable to say that after her murder, no other murder of this kind took place in London. You can't really make that claim with respect to Mary Kelly's murder. Kosminski was committed on the 4th of February 1891, just before the Coles murder. The lead suspect for this crime was her sailor boyfriend, Thomas Sadler, and he was charged with her murder on the 16th of February. Rarely for this period in his career, Swanson personally interviewed Sadler. Sadler, who was defended by the Seamen's Union, was the subject of an identification where the witness failed to identify him. It seems likely that this witness was Joseph Lewender, who testified at the inquest into the murder of Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square that he had seen Eddowes with a man who looked like a sailor shortly before she had been murdered. Probably the only trustworthy description of the assassin was that given by a gentleman who on the night of the Mitre Square murder noticed in Duke Street, Aldgate, a couple standing under the lamp at the corner of the passage leading into Mitre Square. The woman was identified as one victim of that night, 30th of September. The witness has confronted Sadler and has failed to identify him. Despite his shortcomings as a witness, which I've already mentioned, this can only refer to Lewender, which tells you all you need to know about how hard up the police were for any sort of witness. The fact that Lewender was used in an attempt to identify Sadler also tells us very clearly that the general police view at that time was that the Ripper hadn't been caught. Obviously, they must have thought that Sadler could have been responsible for the double event murders, and Swanson was involved in this investigation in person. Anderson himself said of Coles's murderer, as in former cases, he left nothing and carried away nothing in the nature of property to afford a clue. Anderson speaks with the assumption that it was the same killer over a week after Kosminski had been detained in an asylum. Lewender's non-identification was described as a confrontation where the witness has just one suspect to pick from rather than a parade of multiple reasonably similar people in a lineup with the suspect somewhere among them. Obviously, parades have much more evidential value than a confrontation identification. Anderson also describes his identification as a confrontation. There's another interesting connection regarding a knife Sadler sold on the morning of Coles's murder. Campbell, who was a seafaring man and at present staying at the Sailors' Home, Wells Street, Whitechapel, stated that at about 11 o'clock on Friday morning at the home he saw Sadler, whom he had not met before. The latter produced a peculiarly shaped knife and offered it for sale for £1. The purchaser then noticed that the handle had a clammy feeling and also that the blade was stained. He washed the knife and when doing so saw that the water had a reddish appearance. On Sunday morning, Campbell went to the Leman Street police station and picked Sadler out from among a number of other men. The witness against Sadler, Donald Campbell, lived in the Sailors' Home. Interestingly, he was also involved in a proper ID parade and picked Sadler out. Incidentally, the knife was deemed to be incapable of inflicting the wounds suffered by Francis Coles. Despite being suspected of being the Whitechapel murderer, and hence Jack the Ripper, nothing could be proved against Sadler and the charges were dropped on the 2nd of March 1891. So what do we have here? Sadler was arrested for the Whitechapel murders after the last of the murders. He was subjected to a confrontation identification where a Jewish witness failed to identify him. This Jewish witness had also previously seen a suspect at Mitre Square. Sadler was defended by the Seamen's Union and one of the witnesses against him lived in the Sailors' Home, which is reminiscent of the Seaside home. Unusually, Swanson was involved in directly interviewing Sadler on the assumption that he might have been Jack the Ripper. Anderson at least initially assumed that the murderer of Coles was the same person who had murdered the earlier victims. Just over a week before all this happened, Kosminski was committed to an asylum. It seems beyond doubt that Swanson and Anderson conflated the details between Kosminski and Sadler. The fact that it was wrongly believed that Kosminski was dead is further evidence that Kosminski was no more than Anderson and Swanson's private hobby horse suspect with nothing to support their theory beyond his Jewishness, insanity and local residence. It should be noticed that the single common denominator and indeed the primary reason for suspicion attaching to Kosminski was his overt insanity, however that might be defined or labelled. This was amplified with the repeated claim that Kosminski was a homicidal maniac, which is at variance with the information in his medical records. Lunatic, yes. Homicidal maniac, no. What can we learn from those medical records? The duration of the attack, which was described as mania, was initially given as 6 months, but this was amended to 6 years, which takes us back to 1885. The cause was supposed to be due to self-abuse. This echoes the reference in the Macnaghten Memorandum. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. Kosminski's madness was attributed to practicing self-abuse. It's quite common in several forms of mental illness for a lack of sexual inhibition to be present, which often manifests itself in open masturbation. However, in the Victorian period, it was believed that masturbation could make you go mad, rather than it being a symptom of certain types of mental illness. He believed he was controlled by an instinct that informed his mind and ate food out of the gutter. His occupation was listed as hairdresser, although it was said that he hadn't attempted work for years. The most violent aspect attaching to Kosminski was that shortly before his committal, he had picked up a knife and threatened his sister. This detail might well have been the clincher in cementing his suspect status in Anderson's eyes. As an inmate, he was placid. The worst behaviour that was recorded, that he once picked up a chair and threatened an attendant. Significantly, he was listed as not being a danger to others. Kosminski became increasingly undernourished, incoherent, morose and dirty until he died in 1919 and his body was released back to his family who were still living in Whitechapel. As I said, the case against Kosminski is founded upon the opinions of Anderson and Swanson. If Kosminski was the lead suspect of the Metropolitan Police, one might expect a degree of unanimity from the police. But no. I've already mentioned that Macnaghten favoured Montague Druitt over Kosminski. In his autobiography, Days of My Years, he doesn't even mention Kosminski, but curiously does refer to the elusive City PC at Mitre Square. On this occasion, it is probable that the police officer on duty in the vicinity saw the murderer with his victim a few minutes before, but no satisfactory description was forthcoming. Detective Inspector Littlechild, who worked at Scotland Yard during the time of the Ripper murders, said in answer to an inquiry from a journalist called George Sims, "I knew Major Griffiths for many years. He probably got his information from Anderson, who only thought he knew." This was only a few years after the publication of Anderson's self-serving autobiography, and Littlechild's attitude towards Anderson's opinions are clear. Then we have the opinions of Inspector Aberline, who was drafted in from Scotland Yard to coordinate the investigation on the ground in Whitechapel. "We have never believed all those stories about Jack the Ripper being dead, or that he was a lunatic, or anything of that kind." None of the investigative officers on the ground favoured Kosminski, which tells us that he could not have been a suspect as a result of crime scene detective work in the East End. Detective Inspector Edmund Reed was in charge of the Criminal Investigation Department in Whitechapel. After the publication of Anderson's Memoirs, he said, "Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove, and, what is more, it was never suggested at the time of the murders." Major Henry Smith, Acting Commissioner of the City of London Police during the Autumn of Terror, was later to say in his memoirs that the Ripper completely beat me and every police officer in London, and I have no more idea now where he lived than I had 20 years ago. There's one other extant record that undoubtedly relates to Aaron Kosminski, and this relates to a slightly odd case that came in front of the Magistrates' Court in December 1889. Kosminski was arrested for having an unmuzzled dog. There was further confusion because he called himself Aaron Abrahams instead of Kosminski. The police found this irregular, and Kosminski was required to explain why he had called himself Abrahams. One of his brothers appeared to back up his claim. His brothers did indeed go by the name Abrahams. This story is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, when Aaron Kosminski gave his explanation, members of the public in the gallery laughed at him. "I goes by the name Abraham sometimes because Kosminski's hard to spell." Laughter. The laughter seems to be a cruel response to Kosminski's simple tone. Secondly, the police regarded Abrahams as a false name. When stopped by an officer, defendant gave a false name and address. Contrary to some claims, it was very clearly understood that people should use their real names when dealing with legal matters, and if they went under another name, then they should explain themselves. It's difficult to make a proper criminological assessment of Kosminski as a suspect. Given that he'd only been living in London for about 6 years and had been suffering from mental illness from around 1885 and hadn't worked for years, one has to wonder exactly how well Kosminski knew the East End in 1881, outside the immediate area within which his family lived. His local knowledge in all likelihood would not have been good. Would he have known the area around Bucks Row or Hanbury Street or Dorset Street? The most immediate crime scene to his stamping ground was Berners Street. His brother Wolfe had lived in Berners Street a few years before. His other brother and sister lived in Greenfield Street, which was quite close by, and in 1888 Wolfe lived in Providence Street, which was only a couple of hundred yards away from where Liz Stride was murdered. However, immediately after Liz Stride was murdered, the whole area was up in arms with police everywhere. But this was the double event, so how could Kosminski have got back home afterwards after murdering Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square? If Kosminski had murdered Polly Nichols at Bucks Row, how did he get past PC Neal on Whitechapel Road and another policeman patrolling the same road, let alone the two fixed point policemen who may well have been on the same stretch of road? How did Kosminski ever get home undetected if he had blood on his person? I've seen this objection raised for other suspects on countless occasions. Incidentally, related claims that Kosminski was living at Zion Square are wrong. It was Wolfe's address after the murders. Kosminski was committed to the lunatic asylum with his condition having commenced in 1885. His madness, or mania as Anderson most commonly described it, was the prime factor which influenced Anderson's suspicion against him, but it was almost impossible for the Ripper to have been overtly mad. How would a madman be a repeated and successful stealth killer, escaping detection in those overcrowded conditions? The culprit must at the very least have been very self-aware. And how could an overt madman who spoke in broken English win the trust of a street-walking prostitute when there was a climate of fear and hysteria on the streets? There's also the claim that there's a DNA match between Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes on some silk material. The claim is made in a book called Naming Jack the Ripper, which lists Russell Edwards as the author, although it was ghostwritten by a well-known ripperologist. The claim is that Kosminski took this silk material, which is described as a shawl but was almost certainly a long table runner, with him on the night of the double event. He presumably had it with him when he killed Elizabeth Stride off Burner Street, and also when he killed Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square. At Mitre Square, after masturbating over it, he left it behind in his victim's blood. Don't forget that Kosminski was said to practice self-abuse. Soon after the city police found the body, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson of the Metropolitan Police, who was on special duty nearby, came on the scene and took the shawl away with him as a crime scene souvenir. The shawl passed through his family as an heirloom until it was brought at auction by Russell Edwards, who had DNA tests performed on the various stains. Allegedly, there was a match against the DNA of Kosminski and Eddowes' relatives. There are huge problems with this claim. Firstly, Amos Simpson was based in Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, which was then past the Metropolitan Police area, but was about 15 miles away from Mitre Square. There's no evidence that he was seconded on any special duties which would have been recorded in police orders. Eddowes was murdered within the jurisdiction of the City London Police, not the Metropolitan Police. There's no record of a Metropolitan policeman being present at Mitre Square. And the suggestion that he would have been allowed to take evidence away with him is ridiculous. Finally, the DNA tests produced results that were far too broad to allow any suggestion that they specifically belonged to Kosminski or Eddowes. In other words, there's no merit in the DNA claim. Despite Kosminski's madness being the main characteristic that recommended him to Anderson as the culprit, this aspect has to be denied by modern ripperologists who favour Kosminski as being Jack the Ripper. In the Victorian period, mental illness and serial killing were both poorly understood. It's now well known that someone suffering from overt mental illness wouldn't be able to become a serial killer, as overt mental illness would preclude planning, plausibility in front of the victims, stealthy behaviour and coherent escape strategies. All essential characteristics for the killer known to history as Jack the Ripper. Even Kosminski theorists realise this. Accordingly, they tend to diagnose Kosminski as a schizophrenic, as conveniently for them, this illness can come on in waves, periodic receding with spells of lucidity. So according to modern Kosminski theorists, he killed during lucid phases, not when he is actually exhibiting signs of madness. Strangely, this denies the veracity of Anderson's claims upon which they based their theory. To Anderson, Kosminski was guilty due to his madness. To modern theorists, Kosminski was guilty despite his madness. Yet the only reason they favour Kosminski is because Anderson favoured him. It really doesn't make much sense, but this is ripperology. Because of the errors we find in the statements made by Macnaghten, Anderson and Swanson about Kosminski, some advocates propose that they weren't referring to Aaron Kosminski, but to someone else. However, these errors are of a piece with the claims made about other police suspects. They all have errors. Ostrog was in France at the time of the murders, and Druitt wasn't a doctor, as claimed by Macnaghten. So we should expect errors in how they described Kosminski. If there was no errors, it would be remarkable. But the errors also undermine the case that any of these suspects were the result of a real investigation, rather than being private hobby horses plucked almost out of thin air in frustration at the inability of the police to find the real culprit. The late Martin Fido searched through the asylum records in the 1980s and concluded that Aaron Kosminski didn't match Macnaghten's suspect. His committal to the asylum was too late and he was too passive. Instead, Martin Fido came up with another possibility. The only problem that his name was David Cohen, not Kosminski. Martin Fido hypothesised that David Cohen was a John Doe type name given to a Jewish lunatic who was not capable of giving an account of himself. He also found an individual called Nathan Kosminski who seemingly disappeared after being diagnosed as a syphilitic not long before Cohen was committed. This allowed Martin Fido to propose that Kosminski was misnamed Kosminski by Macnaghten and by implication Swanson, and that in the asylum he was recorded as David Cohen. Cohen was brought to Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary on the 7th of December 1888 after having been found by a policeman wandering around. His family background was unknown. On the 21st of December he was sent to Colney Hatch Asylum. His behaviour was recorded as being violent and he only spoke German, which probably means Yiddish. Cohen became increasingly feeble and died on the 20th of October 1889, but there's no record of him having syphilis, which discounts the Kosminski connection. Cohen was committed under a month after the murder of Mary Kelly, although not in March 1889. He died soon after, but he had no known family. He wasn't sent back to his brother's house after being in the workhouse, and he was in Whitechapel Workhouse, which is more difficult to confuse with Stepney Workhouse. At the end of August 1889, Anderson told an American journalist who wanted to visit Whitechapel, "After a stranger has gone over it, he takes a much more lenient view of our failure to find Jack the Ripper, as they call him, than he did before." So in late August 1889, when Cohen was maybe 9 weeks away from his death, Anderson had no idea as to the identity of Jack the Ripper. Yet his suspect was supposedly identified by a witness, and after this identification he returned to his brother's house and was only then sent to Colney Hatch. This doesn't fit Cohen at all. Cohen is an even poorer match to the Kosminski suspect than is Aaron Kosminski. The Kosminski case is of great interest as it illustrates how the police operated in the late Victorian period. Kosminski ticked 2, possibly 3 boxes. He was mad, and the police wrongly believed that a madman could have been responsible for these murders. Indeed, they almost thought it was a prerequisite. He was Jewish, and the police believed they were a mysterious group, literally a law unto themselves, foreigners, and surely no true-born bluff Englishman could have been responsible for these horrendous crimes. Lastly, there's a hint in the records that Kosminski may have been gay, a woman hater. There was a belief that homosexuals hated women, and Kosminski was so described. We are left wondering, why or how did Kosminski become a suspect in the first place? The records tell us there was a door-to-door inquiry conducted soon after the double event. Clearly, some of the policemen who took part in that exercise encountered something that they took to be obstruction from the local Jewish population. This reinforced Anderson's prejudice that the Jews would shelter one of their own and not give them up to Gentile justice. The murders did after all take place in an area of recent Jewish settlement. There was also this belief that an Englishman couldn't have committed such crimes. Add to this Anderson's obsession that the culprit was suffering from a sexual mania. We know that the asylum registers were regularly checked during this period to see if a likely culprit might turn up. I have sent officers to all lunatic asylums in London to make inquiry respecting persons recently admitted or discharged. Undoubtedly, this is where they obtained Kosminski's name after he was sent to Colney Hatch. It is very clear that his suspect status didn't originate from the bottom upwards via a police investigation on the ground in Whitechapel, as Aberline and Reed would have been running that inquiry. Anderson regularly told fibs to bolster his own image, his own ego. As time passed, his position hardened from a theory to an ascertained fact. Have we reason to doubt Anderson? Yes. All of his colleagues, save Swanson, doubted him. Then we have the textual difficulties, the simple errors of fact that undermine all credibility. Kosminski was not the police solution, it was Anderson's and Swanson's solution, and their account was so full of holes that it lacks any credibility. I'm very aware that this episode has been very text heavy, based on original source documents rather than a crime scene investigation. This is because you can't do a crime scene investigation with Kosminski. The case is totally reliant on historic texts, but when they're put together, the whole case collapses completely. Kosminski died as he lived most of his life, a hopeless lunatic, and was buried in a Jewish cemetery in East Ham. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share, like, and ring that notification bell and comment below. What do you think?